Grandma wanted someone successful to have the house. My sister Vanessa said barely 20 minutes after we buried her. And the worst part was that my parents nodded like those words made perfect sense. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there in Grandma Margaret's front hallway holding the casserole dish someone from church had brought over after the funeral, staring at the family portraits lining the wall. The same wall I had dusted every Saturday for the last 8 years while Grandma's arthritis slowly stole the strength from her hands. Vanessa crossed her arms and leaned against the doorway to the dining room like she already owned the place. Maybe in her mind, she did. Her black cashmere coat probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and her heels clicked softly against Grandma's hardwood floors every time she shifted her weight. Honestly, Evelyn, she continued with that calm voice she used whenever she wanted to sound reasonable, it just makes sense. I mean, I actually have the resources to maintain a property like this. I looked over at my mother, hoping for something. A correction, a hesitation, even discomfort. But Mom just smoothed the wrinkles from her skirt and avoided my eyes. Dad cleared his throat near the fireplace and said, "Your grandmother wanted the house to stay in the family." I almost laughed at that because I was family only when someone needed a ride to a doctor's appointment or help changing bedsheets at 2 in the morning. The December wind rattled the old windows gently behind me. Outside, the last guests from the funeral were pulling away from the curb one by one, their headlights glowing against the wet Connecticut street. Inside the house, it already felt like I didn't belong there anymore. Vanessa walked farther into the living room, glancing around slowly. "I'm thinking we should probably renovate the kitchen first," she said casually. "Open up the space a little. Maybe tear down that ugly wallpaper." My chest tightened. Grandma had picked that wallpaper herself in 1989 after saving coupons from the grocery store for almost 6 months. Sunflowers. Bright yellow ones. She used to joke that they made winter feel shorter. I set the casserole dish down carefully on the counter before I dropped it. "Grandma loved this kitchen," I said quietly. Vanessa shrugged. Grandma also still used a flip phone until last year. Dad let out a small chuckle at that. I felt something cold settle into my stomach then. Not anger exactly. Something heavier. The kind of feeling you get when a truth you've avoided for years finally sits down in front of you and refuses to move. I had spent nearly a decade driving Grandma to physical therapy twice a week. I knew which tea helped her sleep when her back hurt. I knew she liked exactly 1 spoonful of sugar in her coffee after breakfast and none after dinner. I knew where she hid birthday cards weeks in advance because she loved being prepared. Vanessa didn't even know Grandma was allergic to lavender soap until she accidentally bought some last Christmas. But somehow Vanessa was the one standing there discussing renovations before the funeral flowers had even started wilting. Mom finally looked at me then, though only briefly. "Honey," she said softly, "you know your sister has always been better with financial matters." Financial matters. That was the phrase they always used whenever they wanted to explain why Vanessa deserved more. More attention, more praise, more patience, more forgiveness. I folded my coat slowly over my arm and looked around the room one more time. Grandma's reading glasses still rested beside her favorite chair. Her knitting basket sat untouched near the lamp. The entire house still smelled faintly like cinnamon and the peppermint lotion she used every night before bed. And suddenly, through all the grief clouding my head, I remembered something she whispered to me 3 weeks earlier while I adjusted the blankets around her shoulders. "Don't let them erase what you did for me, sweetheart." At the time, I thought she was talking about memories. Standing there now, while Vanessa discussed paint colors for a house that wasn't even legally hers yet, I realized Grandma may have meant something else entirely. That night, I stayed in Grandma Margaret's guest room because I could not bear the thought of driving back to my apartment with her funeral still fresh in my chest. The house sounded different without her in it. Too quiet. Too still. I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking downstairs and the occasional hum of the furnace kicking on against the December cold, but that was all. No television playing softly in the background. No gentle cough from the hallway. No smell of oatmeal rising from the kitchen before sunrise. I sat on the edge of the bed folding one of Grandma's cardigans in my lap long after midnight. Pale blue. Soft from years of washing. The sleeves still carried traces of her peppermint lotion. For 8 years, this house had been more familiar to me than my own apartment 20 miles away in Hartford. I knew which stair creaked near the upstairs bathroom and how long the kitchen faucet needed to run before the hot water came through in winter. I knew Grandma liked her tea steeped exactly 4 minutes because 5 made it taste bitter like hospital coffee. There was a time I thought all those little things mattered to my family too. But sometime over the years, my role quietly shifted from granddaughter to caretaker, and eventually to something even less visible than that. Just useful. Around 7 the next morning, I walked downstairs and found Vanessa already sitting at the dining room table with her laptop open beside a real estate brochure. Her blonde hair was perfectly curled even this early, and she was drinking coffee from Grandma's favorite ceramic mug without asking. Mom stood beside the counter slicing bagels while Dad read the newspaper near the window. The entire scene looked so ordinary that for one strange second I wondered if yesterday had happened at all. Then Vanessa glanced up and said, "Good morning. I was just telling Mom we should probably repaint before listing the property." Listing the property. The words hit me harder than I expected. Grandma had not even been gone 48 hours. I stopped near the doorway. "You were selling the house?" Vanessa exchanged a quick look with Dad before answering. "Well, obviously. I mean, none of us actually live here." I stared at her. "I was here almost every day." She sighed softly, like I was being difficult on purpose. "Evelyn, helping Grandma out does not mean you were building equity in the property." Dad lowered the newspaper slowly, but still did not look directly at me. "Your sister is thinking practically." Practical. Another family word. Practical meant Vanessa got praise for being ambitious, while I got thanked for being dependable. Practical meant I spent my Saturdays helping Grandma shower, while Vanessa posted photos from Napa Valley wine tours, and everyone commented how successful she looked. Mom carried a plate of bagels to the table, carefully avoiding the tension hanging in the room. "Sweetheart, nobody is trying to hurt you," she said quietly. "We just assumed you understood." Understood what exactly? That the daughter who stayed would always come second to the daughter who performed better at family parties? I looked toward the hallway where Grandma's walker still stood folded neatly beside the coat closet. Last February, during the worst snowstorm of the year, I drove 30 miles through icy roads because Grandma called at 2 in the morning struggling to breathe. I sat with her in the emergency room for 11 hours while Vanessa sent flowers with a card signed, "Thinking of you from sunny California." Everyone praised her for remembering flowers. Nobody remembered I missed 3 days of work. Vanessa clicked something on her laptop and turned the screen slightly toward Mom. "I think if we modernize the kitchen and remove some of the older furniture, we could easily get close to $900,000. $900,000. Suddenly, every warm memory in that house sounded smaller than money. I walked quietly into the kitchen and stared out the window above the sink. Snow had started falling lightly over Grandma's backyard. Her bird feeder still hung near the oak tree exactly where she liked it. Last winter, she told me she hoped the cardinals would keep visiting after she was gone because they made the yard feel alive in winter. I swallowed hard and wrapped my hands around the edge of the counter. Then I noticed something strange. Grandma's desk drawer near the breakfast nook was slightly open. That drawer was always locked. The drawer should not have been open. Grandma Margaret kept it locked for as long as I could remember. Even when her hands became stiff from arthritis, she still carried the tiny silver key in the pocket of her cardigan every single day. I stared at the narrow opening from across the kitchen while Vanessa continued discussing backsplash samples behind me like we were standing inside a model home instead of the house where our grandmother had just died. Something inside me tightened quietly. Not panic. Recognition. The same feeling I used to get as a child whenever I walked into a room and realized everyone else already knew something I did not. I waited until Dad carried his coffee into the living room, and Mom followed Vanessa upstairs to look at the guest bedrooms before I finally crossed the kitchen floor toward the desk. My heartbeat sounded too loud in the silence. The desk itself was old cherry wood, worn smooth near the handles from decades of use. Grandma used to sit there every morning paying bills by hand while listening to Frank Sinatra records on the radio. She trusted paper more than computers. Said paper could not disappear with the push of a button. I slid the drawer open carefully. Empty. Completely empty except for a few paper clips and one dried-out pen rolling near the back corner. I froze. Grandma kept important documents there. Insurance papers. Bank statements. Old letters tied with ribbon. I knew because she asked me to organize them for her every tax season. But now the drawer looked cleaned out so thoroughly, it almost seemed staged. I crouched lower and noticed faint scratches around the lock itself. Fresh scratches. The wood splintered slightly near the metal edge. Someone had forced it open. A floorboard creaked behind me. Looking for something? Vanessa's voice floated into the kitchen smooth as glass. I turned too quickly. She stood near the doorway holding her phone loosely in one hand. Her expression looked calm, but her eyes sharpened for just a second when she noticed the open drawer. The drawer was locked yesterday, I said quietly. Vanessa walked farther into the room. Maybe Grandma unlocked it before she passed. No, I answered before I could stop myself. She never left it unlocked. Vanessa gave a small shrug and stepped beside the counter. Well, honestly, Evelyn, maybe it is time to let some things go. Let some things go. The sentence landed strangely. Too rehearsed. Too quick. I studied her face carefully, but she was already looking down at her phone again. By the way, she added casually, a realtor is stopping by tomorrow afternoon. I stared at her. Tomorrow. There is no reason to drag this out. She slipped her phone into her coat pocket and opened the refrigerator like she belonged there. Mom and Dad agree. Of course they did. They always agreed with Vanessa eventually. That was the rhythm of our family. Vanessa pushed. My parents bent. I adjusted. The pattern had existed so long nobody even noticed it anymore. I remembered my 10th birthday party when Vanessa cried because she wanted the larger slice of cake with extra frosting roses. Mom gave it to her immediately and promised me another cake next weekend. There was never another cake. Years later, when Grandma fell and fractured her hip, Vanessa told everyone she wished she could help more, but her career kept her too busy traveling. Dad called her ambitious. When I reduced my own work hours to care for Grandma after surgery, he called me available. One word sounded impressive. The other sounded temporary. Vanessa closed the refrigerator and looked toward the hallway. You know, she said lightly, Grandma worried about you sometimes. My stomach tightened. What does that mean? She thought you built your whole life around taking care of other people. Vanessa smiled faintly. That is not really living. For a second I could not speak. Because the cruelest thing about manipulation is how often it wears the face of concern. Vanessa brushed invisible lint from her coat sleeve before heading upstairs again. Halfway up the staircase, she paused and glanced back down at me. Oh, and Harold Whitmore called earlier. The lawyer. He wants the family at his office Friday morning for the official reading. Then she smiled again. Small. Certain. I guess we will finally make everything legal. Friday morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. The kind of Connecticut winter morning where the sidewalks looked silver with frost, and every breath hung visibly in the air for a second before disappearing. I drove to Harold Whitmore's office with both hands tight around the steering wheel the entire way there. I barely slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that empty desk drawer and the fresh scratches around the lock. By the time I parked outside the old brick law office downtown, my stomach felt hollow. Harold Whitmore had handled my grandmother's legal affairs for nearly 30 years. Grandma trusted him the same way some people trust doctors or pastors. Completely. His office occupied the second floor above a small insurance agency near Main Street, and walking inside felt strangely familiar. The hallway still smelled faintly like old books and coffee. Even the waiting room furniture looked untouched since the 1990s. Vanessa was already there when I arrived. Of course she was. She sat near the window in a cream-colored wool coat scrolling through her phone while Mom and Dad quietly drank coffee from paper cups beside her. Nobody looked particularly sad anymore. Grief had already started turning into logistics. Vanessa glanced up when I entered and gave me a polite smile that never reached her eyes. You made it, she said lightly. I nodded and took the chair farthest from everyone else. The silence between us felt heavy but practiced, like we had all spent years avoiding conversations we should have had long ago. A few minutes later, Harold opened his office door himself. He looked older than I remembered, his silver hair thinner, his shoulders slightly stooped beneath his navy cardigan. But his eyes sharpened immediately when they landed on me. Evelyn, he said quietly, could I speak with you for a moment before we begin? Vanessa's posture stiffened almost instantly. Why privately? She asked before I could answer. Harold turned toward her calmly. Because your grandmother requested certain conversations remain confidential unless necessary. The room went still after that. Dad cleared his throat awkwardly while Mom stared down into her coffee cup. Harold gestured gently toward his office, and I followed him inside. The office looked exactly the way I remembered from childhood visits. Dark wooden shelves lined with legal binders. Framed photographs of fishing trips on the wall. A brass desk lamp casting warm yellow light across stacks of paperwork. Harold closed the door softly behind us and motioned for me to sit. Then he removed his glasses slowly and rubbed the bridge of his nose like a man carrying something heavier than paperwork. "Your grandmother was worried before she passed," he said finally. I felt my pulse quicken. Worried about what? Harold studied me carefully for a long moment before answering. About pressure. About influence. About people around her becoming very interested in the house. I swallowed hard. Vanessa? He did not answer directly. Margaret loved both her granddaughters, he said carefully. But she was not blind. The room suddenly felt too warm. "There is another will, is there not?" I asked quietly. Harold leaned back in his chair. "There are additional instructions your grandmother left behind." My breath caught slightly. "Then why are we even here?" He folded his hands together slowly. "Because the first document still has to be presented formally before anything else can happen." Something about the way he said it unsettled me, like he was choosing each word very carefully. "Harold," I whispered, "did somebody change her will?" He looked down at the papers on his desk instead of answering immediately. Outside his office window, snow drifted softly across Main Street while traffic moved slowly below. Finally, he spoke in a lower voice. "Your grandmother anticipated conflict. That is all I can say for now." My chest tightened. "You saw the drawer, did you not?" The question escaped before I could stop it. Harold's eyes lifted sharply toward mine. For the first time since I arrived, I saw genuine concern cross his face. "What drawer?" he asked quietly. I told him about the scratches. The missing papers. Vanessa's strange behavior. Harold listened without interrupting once. When I finished, he stood and walked slowly toward the office window with one hand resting against the glass. "I was afraid of this," he murmured almost to himself. Then he turned back toward me, his expression suddenly serious enough to make my stomach drop. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "whatever happens in that room today, do not react too quickly. Your grandmother prepared for exactly this possibility." When Harold and I walked back into the conference room, Vanessa immediately looked up from her phone with the kind of expression people wear when they think they already know the ending of a story. Mom sat rigidly beside her, twisting a paper napkin between her fingers while Dad stared at the framed painting on the wall like he wanted to be anywhere else. Harold took his seat slowly at the head of the long oak table and adjusted the stack of folders in front of him with careful precision. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The quiet in that room felt fragile. Finally, Harold cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he said in his steady professional voice. "As you know, Margaret Carter requested a formal reading of her estate documents following her passing." Vanessa crossed one leg over the other smoothly and folded her hands in her lap. Calm, confident, like someone waiting for paperwork instead of judgment. Harold opened the first folder and began reading through the legal language slowly. Most of it sounded ordinary at first. Financial accounts, jewelry allocations, charitable donations to the church and local library. Mom received several antique pieces. Dad was left a small investment account. Vanessa barely reacted through any of it. She simply waited. Then Harold reached the section regarding the house. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. "The residential property located on Willow Creek Road shall transfer in full ownership to Vanessa Carter Whitmore." Vanessa exhaled softly beside me. Not surprised. Relieved. Dad nodded once under his breath, while Mom finally looked up from the napkin in her hands. I stared at Harold, waiting for something else. Some correction. Some missing sentence. But he simply continued reading. Vanessa smiled faintly and leaned back in her chair. "Well," she said lightly once Harold finished the paragraph, "I suppose Grandma wanted the house in stable hands after all." The words settled heavily into the room. Stable hands. I kept my face still even though my chest felt hollow. Across the table, Harold closed the folder carefully but did not look at anyone. Something about his silence felt deliberate. Vanessa glanced toward me briefly. "I know this is emotional for you, Evelyn," she said with practiced softness. "But honestly, this arrangement makes the most sense long term." There it was again. That calm voice pretending concern while quietly reducing my entire relationship with Grandma into sentimentality. I folded my hands tightly beneath the table to stop them from shaking. Dad finally spoke. Your grandmother appreciated everything you did, he said carefully. But Vanessa has experience handling major assets. Assets, not memories, not family. Assets. I remembered changing Grandma's oxygen tank at 3 in the morning while Vanessa posted engagement photos from a beach resort in Maui. I remembered sitting beside Grandma during chemotherapy appointments holding her hand while she slept in those stiff hospital recliners under fluorescent lights. Somehow none of those things counted as responsibility in my family. Harold remained completely still through all of it. That unsettled me more than the will itself. Because he did not look surprised. He looked patient. Vanessa reached for her purse and smiled toward Mom. I should probably contact the realtor this afternoon so we can move quickly after the holidays. Then she turned toward me again. Of course you can take a few personal items from the house before staging begins. Personal items. Like I was some distant relative cleaning out leftovers after an estate sale. Before I could answer, Harold finally lifted his eyes from the table. There is one additional matter, he said quietly. The room paused instantly. Vanessa's smile flickered slightly. Harold opened a second folder much thinner than the first. He removed a sealed ivory envelope from inside and placed it carefully on the desk between his hands. I recognized Grandma's handwriting immediately. Elegant, slanted slightly to the right. My heartbeat stumbled hard against my ribs. Harold looked directly at Vanessa first, then Dad, then Mom. Margaret instructed me to present this only if disputes or concerns arose regarding the estate. Nobody moved. Even Vanessa stopped smiling. Harold rested one hand lightly against the envelope. She was very specific about that. For the first time all morning, I watched uncertainty enter my sister's face. Harold did not open the envelope immediately. He simply rested his fingertips against it while the silence inside that conference room slowly thickened around all of us. Outside the office windows, snow drifted steadily across Main Street, soft and quiet against the gray afternoon sky. Inside, nobody moved. Vanessa was the first to recover. She let out a small, nervous laugh and leaned back in her chair again. I am sure Grandma just wanted to leave some sentimental note, she said lightly. She was emotional near the end. Harold looked at her for a long moment before answering. Margaret was many things, he said calmly. Emotional was rarely one of them. Vanessa's smile faded slightly after that. Dad shifted uncomfortably beside her, while Mom stared down at the envelope like she already knew more than she wanted to admit. I could feel my own heartbeat in my throat. Harold finally slid one finger carefully beneath the seal and opened the envelope with deliberate slowness. Inside was a folded letter and a small silver flash drive attached to a keychain I recognized instantly. Tiny blue enamel flowers. Grandma kept it attached to her spare house key for years. My chest tightened the second I saw it. Harold unfolded the letter first. This document is handwritten and signed by Margaret Carter approximately 6 weeks before her passing, he explained quietly. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly now. Can we please not turn this into some dramatic family spectacle? She asked sharply. Harold ignored the interruption and began reading aloud. If you are hearing this, it means there has been confusion regarding my wishes about the house on Willow Creek Road. His voice remained steady, but every word seemed to land heavier than the last. I have watched tension grow inside this family for years, and I know exactly why. Nobody spoke. Even Vanessa stayed silent now. Harold continued reading. Evelyn gave up more than anyone knows to care for me during the hardest years of my life. She sat beside me during surgeries, cleaned this house when I no longer could, and treated me with dignity when I felt myself disappearing. My eyes burned suddenly, but I kept perfectly still. Across the table, Mom lowered her face into her hands. Dad stared blankly toward the far wall. Harold paused briefly before continuing. Vanessa visits when convenient. Evelyn stayed when it was difficult. Vanessa inhaled sharply. That is not fair, she muttered under her breath. But her voice lacked confidence now. Harold looked down at the second page. I became concerned after repeated conversations pressuring me to simplify my estate decisions. Therefore, I created additional documentation to ensure my intentions could not be altered after my death. The room froze. Completely. I looked toward Dad instinctively. His face had gone pale. Vanessa sat rigidly beside him, no longer pretending calm. Harold lifted the flash drive carefully between 2 fingers. Margaret recorded a video statement to accompany her final instructions. Vanessa immediately straightened in her chair. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. Grandma was sick. People say emotional things near the end of life. Harold's expression hardened slightly for the first time since I arrived. Margaret recorded the video in my office with 2 legal witnesses present. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it again. Dad rubbed one trembling hand across his forehead while Mom whispered softly, "Oh my God." I suddenly remembered something Grandma said months earlier while we sat together on the back porch during late summer. She had watched Vanessa drive away after one of her short visits and quietly stirred lemon into her iced tea before saying, "Some people only show up when they hear the word inheritance." At the time I thought she sounded tired. Now I realized she sounded prepared. Harold carefully slid the letter back onto the table and folded his hands together. "There is more," he said quietly. "But before I continue, everyone in this room needs to understand something very clearly." His eyes moved slowly from Vanessa to Dad to Mom before finally resting on me. Margaret anticipated exactly this moment. Nothing that happens next is accidental. Harold stood slowly from his chair and walked toward the cabinet behind his desk where an older desktop computer sat beside a printer and several framed family photographs. Nobody said a word while he inserted the small flash drive into the computer. The only sound inside the conference room came from the faint hum of the heating vent and the soft clicking of keys beneath Harold's fingers. Vanessa shifted beside me, crossing and uncrossing her legs repeatedly now. The confidence she wore earlier that morning had started cracking around the edges. Dad looked exhausted suddenly, older than he had even at the funeral. Mom kept dabbing nervously beneath her eyes with the same crumpled napkin from before. Harold turned the monitor slightly toward all of us and clicked the video file. For one brief second the screen remained black. Then Grandma Margaret appeared. My breath caught instantly. She sat in Harold's office wearing her pale green cardigan with the pearl buttons she loved every winter. Her silver hair was brushed neatly back from her face, and although she looked thinner than I remembered, her eyes were sharp and completely alert. Alive. The room went still in a way I cannot fully describe. It felt like time itself paused. Grandma looked directly into the camera and gave a small tired smile. "Well," she said softly, "if this video is being watched, then I was right to worry." Vanessa immediately looked away from the screen. Grandma folded her hands carefully in her lap before continuing. "I have spent many months thinking about what happens after I am gone. Not just to my home, but to this family." Her voice remained calm, clear, steady enough that no one could claim confusion or weakness. "I know there has been pressure placed on me regarding the house on Willow Creek Road. Conversations disguised as concern. Suggestions disguised as practicality." Dad closed his eyes briefly at those words. Grandma continued speaking directly into the camera. "I also know exactly who stayed beside me when things became difficult." My throat tightened painfully. Evelyn drove me to every doctor appointment after I stopped driving. She slept in hospital chairs when I was afraid to be alone. She learned how to manage my medications before she learned how to rest herself. Tears blurred my vision for a moment, but I forced myself not to look away from the screen. Across the table, Vanessa stared rigidly at the carpet now. Grandma gave a faint sad smile. "There is a difference between visiting someone and caring for them. One takes an afternoon. The other costs years." Nobody breathed. Nobody interrupted. Outside the office windows, snow continued drifting quietly down over Main Street, while Grandma's voice filled the room like she had never left it at all. "I love both my granddaughters," she continued. "But love should not erase truth." Vanessa suddenly sat forward sharply. "This is manipulative," she muttered under her breath. Harold did not react. Grandma's expression softened slightly on the screen. "Vanessa, if you are watching this, I hope someday you understand that charm and success are not the same thing as loyalty." Vanessa's face went completely pale. Dad lowered his head into his hands. Mom began crying silently beside him. Then Grandma reached toward something off camera and held up a folded document. "The will previously presented is not my final legal instruction," she said clearly. "I signed an updated version after becoming concerned that pressure was being placed upon me during a period of declining health." I heard Vanessa inhale sharply beside me. Grandma looked directly into the camera one last time. "My home belongs to the person who treated it like a home while I was still alive." My chest tightened so suddenly I could barely breathe. Grandma smiled gently then. The same smile she used whenever she handed me warm cinnamon rolls on snowy mornings before school. "Evelyn," she said softly, "thank you for staying." The video ended a second later. The screen faded black again. Nobody moved afterward. The silence inside that conference room no longer felt tense. It felt exposed, like every secret in the room had finally been dragged into daylight. Vanessa was the first person to stand up after the video ended. Her chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor, breaking the silence that had settled over the conference room like snowfall. "This is insane," she snapped, her voice trembling now despite her obvious effort to stay composed. Grandma was emotional and confused near the end. "Harold, you know that." Harold remained seated calmly behind his desk. Margaret completed cognitive evaluations with her physicians less than 2 months before recording that video, he said evenly. She was fully competent. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. "You are seriously going to let a manipulated old woman rewrite everything because Evelyn played nurse for a few years?" The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed something I had spent years pretending not to notice. Vanessa truly believed caregiving was beneath her. To her, love only counted when it looked impressive from a distance. Dad finally stood up too. "Vanessa," he said quietly, "enough." But even his voice lacked conviction now. Mom looked exhausted, like someone who had spent too many years balancing loyalty against convenience until both collapsed at once. Harold opened another folder on the desk and removed a fresh set of legal documents. Margaret's updated will was signed in this office with 2 witnesses and filed properly with the county clerk 6 weeks before her passing, he explained. The previous version is no longer valid. Vanessa stared at the paperwork like she physically could not process what she was hearing. "No," she whispered. "No, she promised me that house." Harold's expression softened slightly. "I believe Margaret promised fairness," he answered quietly. "Those are not always the same thing." I sat perfectly still through all of it. Oddly enough, I did not feel victorious. I felt tired, like someone who had been carrying invisible weight for years and suddenly realized how heavy it truly was only after setting it down. Harold slid the updated will across the desk toward us. "The property on Willow Creek Road transfers in full ownership to Evelyn Carter." My name looked strange written there so plainly, almost unreal. Mom covered her mouth with shaking fingers while Dad slowly lowered himself back into his chair. Vanessa looked directly at me then for the first time since the meeting began. Not angry exactly. Cornered. "You planned this," she said softly. I blinked at her. "Plan what?" "All of it," she whispered. "The caregiving. Staying close to Grandma. Making yourself look loyal." For one brief second, I almost laughed because that accusation revealed more about Vanessa than it ever could about me. She genuinely could not imagine loving someone without expecting profit in return. I looked down at my hands folded quietly in my lap. The same hands that massaged Grandma's swollen fingers after chemotherapy. The same hands that cooked oatmeal at 5 in the morning because certain medications made her nauseous if she took them on an empty stomach. There had been nights I cried alone in my car after leaving her house because I was so exhausted I could barely see the road home. None of that felt strategic. It felt human. Harold closed the folder carefully. "There is one final matter," he said. Everyone looked toward him again. "Margaret specifically requested that no sale of the property occur for a minimum of 3 years following transfer." Vanessa's face tightened instantly. I understood immediately why Grandma added that clause. She wanted the house protected, not just legally, but emotionally. Protected from becoming another quick transaction wrapped in family excuses. Vanessa grabbed her purse abruptly. "I cannot sit here listening to this anymore." She turned toward the door, but paused before leaving. "You think this makes you special?" she said coldly toward me. "Enjoy the house, Evelyn. See if it keeps you warm at night." Then she walked out without another word. The office door slammed behind her hard enough to rattle the framed pictures on the wall. Nobody moved afterward. Dad stared down at the table, unable to meet my eyes. Mom quietly cried beside him. And for the first time in my entire life, nobody asked me to comfort them. 3 weeks later, I stood alone in Grandma Margaret's kitchen, watching snow fall softly across the backyard while a kettle warmed on the stove beside me. The house felt quiet again, but not empty anymore. Different. Peaceful in a way I had almost forgotten homes could feel. Most of Vanessa's calls stopped after the second week. At first, she left furious voicemails demanding Harold fix the situation. Then came long emotional messages accusing me of tearing the family apart. Eventually, even those disappeared. Silence replaced them. Not the heavy silence that used to sit between us at family dinners, but something cleaner, like the quiet after a storm finally passes through. Mom called occasionally now. Her voice always sounded smaller somehow. Careful. One afternoon she apologized for not defending me more over the years. I listened quietly while standing at the same kitchen counter where Grandma once rolled pie dough every Thanksgiving morning. I appreciated the apology, but I noticed something important too. Some wounds stop hurting long before they fully heal. Dad still had not called at all. Strangely, that hurt less than I thought it would. Maybe because for the first time in my life, I stopped measuring my worth through other people's approval. I walked slowly through the house that afternoon carrying a small cardboard box filled with old photographs I found tucked inside the hallway closet. Pictures of Grandma at 25 wearing bright red lipstick beside Grandpa's fishing boat. Pictures of Mom and Dad smiling before life hardened both of them into quieter versions of themselves. Pictures of Vanessa and me as children sitting together on the front porch swing during summer storms. Looking at those photographs felt strange now. Sad, but clarifying. Families do not fall apart all at once. Sometimes they separate slowly over years through small choices nobody talks about. Tiny acts of favoritism. Quiet resentments. Love offered unevenly until one child learns they are celebrated while another learns they are simply dependable. I carried the photo box into the living room, where Grandma's chair still sat near the window exactly where she left it. Her knitting basket rested beside the lamp untouched. For days after the will reading, I considered changing everything in the house just to stop feeling haunted by memories. New furniture, new paint, different curtains. But eventually I realized something. The house did not make me feel trapped. It made me feel seen. Every corner held proof that love had existed there honestly, at least once. That mattered more than I could explain. The kettle whistled softly from the kitchen, and I walked back down the hallway, my socks sliding slightly across the hardwood floors. Grandma polished herself every spring until her knees became too weak. I smiled faintly, remembering how stubborn she was about those floors. She used to say old houses survived because somebody cared enough to maintain them even when nobody noticed the work. I finally understood she was never only talking about houses. After pouring tea into Grandma's favorite floral mug, I walked toward the back door and looked outside again. Snow covered the garden now, smooth and untouched except for the bird feeder hanging near the oak tree. Two bright red cardinals perched there eating quietly together. Last winter, Grandma told me cardinals always appear when someone you love wants you to know they are still near. At the time I smiled politely because she loved little sayings like that. But standing there alone in her kitchen with warm tea between my hands and soft snow falling over the backyard she protected for 40 years, I suddenly hoped she was right. I no longer felt angry at Vanessa, or even disappointed in my parents. Exhausted maybe, older in certain ways, but not angry. Because anger still ties you to people who stopped protecting your heart a long time ago. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel invisible anymore. Grandma saw me, not the version of me that solved problems quietly or sacrificed without complaint. She saw the real cost of staying loyal inside a family that often rewarded performance more than kindness. The house creaked softly around me as the furnace turned on again against the winter cold. I wrapped both hands around the mug